So, want to get a grip on encryption? It's everywhere online, but who really knows how it all works?
Right.
Today, we'll take a deep dive into how it protects your data.
It's kind of wild how encryption is protecting everything we do digitally. Like every time you shop online, check your bank account, even
Hmm.
send a message, it's all happening behind the scenes.
Seriously, it's pretty amazing. But let's back up for a sec. What exactly is encryption?
So, at its heart, encryption is all about turning information into something unreadable, making it impossible to understand unless you have the key to unlock it.
Makes sense. Okay, now I've heard these terms data at rest and data in transit. What's the difference?
Yeah, good question. Data at rest, that's just info stored on a device, like a computer's hard drive. It's not actively being used. Think of all those files just sitting there.
Okay, so say someone gets their hands on my laptop. How does encryption protect my data then?
Ah, that's where full disk encryption comes in. Tools like BitLocker for Windows or File Vault for Mac. It's basically like putting a lock on your entire hard drive. With full disk encryption, even if someone stole your computer, they wouldn't be able to access any of the data without that key.
So it's like a mega safe for your entire digital life. Makes sense. But what if you only want to protect certain files, not the whole shebang?
You got it. That's where file-level encryption comes in. It lets you encrypt individual files or folders. Windows has a built-in feature called EFS that does just that. And there are also third-party tools for other operating systems as well.
Extra security for your top secret stuff. Okay, but what about when we're actually using the internet, sending emails, browsing websites, that kind of stuff? That's data in transit, right?
Exactly. And it's super important to protect because as that data moves across networks, it's vulnerable. This is where HTTPS comes in. You know that little padlock you see in your browser?
Oh yeah, the sign of a secure connection.
Right. That's HTTPS using encryption to keep your data safe. It uses a combo of symmetric and asymmetric encryption.
Hold on, wait. Symmetric versus asymmetric.
Yeah, so with symmetric encryption, both sides, the sender and receiver, use the same key. It's fast, but the trick is, how do you share that key securely in the first place?
Right, that's where asymmetric comes in.
Exactly. It uses two keys, one public, one private.
Okay, so let me see if I get this. With HTTPS, the website gives my browser its public key, and my browser uses that to encrypt the data.
Bingo. And only the website with its private key can decrypt the data. It ensures that only the intended recipient can read it.
Clever. But wouldn't using two keys for every single thing slow everything down?
It would. So after using asymmetric encryption to establish that secure connection, HTTPS generates a unique symmetric key, a session key just for that session.
Okay, so it's like using one really high security lock to swap a key, then using a faster lock for the rest of the conversation.
You got it. And because it's unique to that session, even if someone snooped and got that key, they wouldn't be able to decrypt anything else.
Makes sense. So HTTPS is like a private tunnel for my data. Now, what about VPNs? They do something similar, right?
They do. VPNs, or virtual private networks, are super useful, especially on public Wi-Fi, like at a coffee shop.
Oh, yeah, those could be sketchy.
Big time. Anyone could be listening in. A VPN creates a secure encrypted connection between your device and the VPN server.
Like a private line, even though it's public Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
So we've talked about how the data is encrypted, but what about the methods used to actually do it? The algorithms.
The algorithms are the recipes. They tell the system exactly how to encrypt and decrypt the data.
The brains of the operation. I've heard there's different types, though. How do you know which one to use?
There are. Each has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Hmm?
The choice depends on how much security you need, the speed of encryption, and how much computing power you have.
Seems complicated. But thankfully, we don't have to pick an algorithm ourselves, right?
Yeah. Thankfully not. Usually the software handles that for you, using the best and most secure options.
Phew. Okay, so we have these algorithms, but is that all you need? I mean, is that enough to unlock the encrypted data?
You need the key. Think of it like a physical key for a door.
So, knowing the algorithms, like knowing how locks work, but you still need the right key to open a specific lock.
Exactly. These keys are like super long passwords linked to the algorithm, and keeping them safe is critical.
It's all about the keys, right?
Yeah.
But what keeps someone from just stealing a key and unlocking all the data?
That's where key management comes in. It's a whole system for securely storing, sharing, and controlling access to those keys.
So it's not enough to just have strong encryption. You also need to carefully manage the keys themselves.
You got it. We'll talk more about that after the break.
Sounds good. But before we do, I have to ask about something that's always confused me.
Well,
Brute force attacks. You know where hackers just try every possible key combination until they find the right one? Does that actually work?
It can, but it's not easy. The longer the key, the harder it is to crack.
Key length, you mean how many characters are in the key?
Yep. The longer the key, the more possible combinations. Imagine combination lock with only a few numbers versus one with tons of numbers. It's way harder to guess.
So longer keys mean more security. Okay, how long are these keys, usually?
It depends on the type of encryption. For symmetric, it's usually 128 bits or larger. Asymmetric uses much larger keys, like 1072 bits or more.
Wow, that's a lot of bits. Why are those so hard to crack?
Think about the number of possible combinations. A 128-bit key has 2 to the power of 128 combinations. Even for supercomputers, trying all those would take forever.
Like trying to count every grain of sand in the world. But hackers are always coming up with new tricks, right?
Yeah.
Are there ways to make those keys even harder to crack?
Absolutely. There's something called key stretching or strengthening.
Okay, how does that work?
Basically, it takes your key and runs it through a hashing function, a special process to make it much more complex.
So it's like adding an extra lock.
You could say that. It just makes the key that much tougher to crack.
So these hashing functions, what are they?
Think of them as a one-way street. They take an input, like your password, and churn out a fixed-length output, but you can't reverse the process.
So even if a hacker got hold of the hashed version of my password, they couldn't just unhash it.
Right. That's why websites don't store your actual password. They store the hashed version. Even if they're hacked, the hackers don't get the passwords themselves.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But how does a website know if I've entered the right password when I try to log in, if they only have the hashed version?
When you create your account, they hash your chosen password and store that. When you log in, they hash what you enter and compare it to the stored hash. If they match, you're in.
It's all about comparing the hashes, not the actual passwords.
Yeah.
It's pretty clever. Okay, so we've covered encrypting hard drives and data in transit, but what about data that's stored in databases? How do you encrypt that?
Great question. And that brings us to database encryption. Databases are essential for lots of applications we use, and they often store incredibly sensitive information.
It's scary to think about what could happen if that data wasn't protected. What are some ways to encrypt databases?
There are a few approaches. One is called transparent data encryption, or TDE. It encrypts the entire database file while it's stored.
Like full disk encryption, but just for the database.
Exactly. It makes sure that only authorized users with the right key can access the data. But it does mean the data needs to be decrypted every time someone wants to use it, which can slow things down.
Makes sense. Are there other ways that are maybe a bit faster?
There's something called column-level encryption, where you just encrypt specific columns within the database.
So instead of the whole thing, you just encrypt the most sensitive parts. Seems like a good compromise. But how do you choose which columns to encrypt?
It depends on how sensitive the data is, any legal requirements, and how bad a data breach would be.
That sounds complicated.
It can be, but there are tools to help. And, we've covered a lot of ground, encrypting hard drives, protecting data on the move, and even securing databases. It's clear that encryption is super important for keeping our digital lives safe. But I'm curious, what are some of the challenges?
Well, encryption is powerful, but it's not a cure-all. Key management is huge. If the keys are compromised, the encryption's useless.
So it's not enough to just have strong encryption. You also need to protect those keys.
Exactly. And doing that can be tricky, especially for large organizations. Plus, encryption can make things more complex, which some people see as a hassle.
So security versus convenience, the age-old dilemma.
And then there's the human factor. People make mistakes, like using weak passwords or falling for phishing scams.
Yeah, human error, that's always a wild card.
You can have the best tech in the world, but if someone clicks on a bad link, it can all be for nothing. So encryption's essential, but it's only one piece of the puzzle.
Right, you need other things like security training and policies. Exactly. Even with all that, there's always a chance something could happen. Nothing is 100% secure.
True. So it's all about minimizing risk, making things as difficult as possible for the bad guys.
That's the goal. And it's always changing. As tech advances, there are new threats. We have to adapt.
Always got to stay one step ahead. Okay, so we've covered how encryption works, the challenges, and why it's important. I guess the big takeaway is that it's crucial to understand, right?
Absolutely. It's a fundamental part of our digital world.
And it goes beyond just protecting our own data.
Right. It's also about safeguarding our privacy, our financial systems, our critical infrastructure, even democracy itself.
Whoa, that's a lot to think about. So where do we go from here? What's next on our encryption journey?
We've got the basics down, so now it's time to look at some real-world examples, how it's used to solve problems and create new possibilities.
Sounds good to me. Let's do it. Okay, so we were talking about how important it is to protect those encryption keys, right? Like, even the strongest encryption won't help if the keys themselves are compromised. That brings us to key management.
It's a big deal, absolutely essential for any encryption system. You got to protect those keys like they're, the keys to the kingdom.
Makes sense. So how do you actually do that? What kind of systems are we talking about here?
Well, there's a whole range of options, depends on how much security you need. For organizations, you often see something called hardware security modules, or HSMs.
HSMs, those sound serious.
They're physical devices, purpose-built to be super secure. They're like little vaults for your keys.
Fort Knox for encryption keys. What about for regular people? Are there key management things we can use?
Yeah, definitely. Password managers are a great example. They store and manage all your passwords so you don't have to remember a million different ones.
Oh, right. Those are pretty handy.
Many of them use encryption to protect your password database and stuff, and a lot of them use multi-factor authentication too.
Extra layer of security. Nice. So it's not just about protecting the keys, it's about who has access to them too, right?
Exactly. You need to control that very carefully. It's like different security clearances, only certain people can access certain keys based on their job or whatever.
So even if someone manages to get one key, the damage is limited. What about the keys themselves? Do they just stay the same forever?
Ideally, no. You want to rotate your keys regularly. It's just good security practice, helps minimize the damage if a key does get compromised.
Oh yeah, that makes sense. But doesn't that sound like a huge pain, especially for big companies with tons of systems and data?
It can be, but there are ways to make it easier. Some systems even automate the process, so it's less of a headache.
Technology to the rescue. Anything else you got to think about with key management?
Key revocation is important too. If an employee leaves or a device gets lost or stolen, you need to deactivate those keys ASA.
Right, so no one can use them to access anything anymore. Makes sense.
And good key management systems keep track of how keys are being used, who's accessing what and when. That's important for audits and stuff.
So a lot goes into managing those keys. But even with the best systems in place, there's always that human element, right? People make mistakes, forget passwords, fall for scams.
You're telling me the best tech in the world can't always account for human error.
So what can you do about that?
Security awareness training is huge. You got to teach people about strong passwords, how to spot phishing attacks, and how to handle sensitive data properly.
Make sure everyone's on the same page. What else can companies do?
Well, you can implement strong password policies, require multi-factor authentication, and limit data access based on people's roles.
So it's a mix of tech and policies.
Yeah, and even then, there's no guarantees, there's always a risk, but you do what you can to minimize it.
And keep learning as things change.
Exactly. Cybersecurity is a constantly evolving field. You got to stay ahead of the curve.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good grasp of encryption now, how it works, the importance of key management, the human element. It's all connected.
It really is. And it affects us all, Encryption's not just about protecting data. It's about safeguarding our privacy, our financial systems, keeping our essential services running. It even impacts our democracy.
That's a lot of responsibility for some ones and zeros. So what's the takeaway message for our listeners? What should they be doing to protect themselves?
Be mindful of the data you share online. Think about what's sensitive and needs protection. Use strong passwords. Enable multi-factor authentication.
The basics, but important.
And be careful on public Wi-Fi, especially for things like banking or shopping. Consider using a VPN.
Good point. And don't fall for those phishing emails or suspicious links.
Right. Be careful out there. It's all about being proactive and protecting yourself.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of the individual stuff, but what about the bigger picture? What are the societal implications of all this?
It's a complex issue. Encryption's a powerful tool for privacy and security, but it can be misused too,
Two sides to every coin.
Exactly. There's this ongoing debate about balancing privacy and security, and encryption's right in the middle of it. Some people think law enforcement should have access to encrypted data to fight crime and terrorism.
But others are worried about government overreach and the erosion of privacy.
That's the dilemma. It's a tough one, no easy answers. And it's going to keep evolving as technology changes and encryption becomes even more embedded in our lives.
It's crazy how something so technical can have such a big impact on society.
It goes to show that technology isn't neutral. It reflects the values and priorities of the people who create and use it.
It's on all of us to think critically about these things and shape how technology evolves.
Mm.
So what's the next step in our encryption journey?
We've laid the groundwork. Now let's look at how encryption is being used in the real world, how it's solving problems and creating new possibilities.
I'm all for that. Where do we start?
Let's dive into the world of messaging apps and social media, see how encryption's changing how we communicate in the digital age.
All right, let's unlock the secrets of secure messaging. So we're back, ready to talk about encryption and messaging apps and social media.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting, right? I mean, we all use these apps every day, but who actually stops to think about the encryption protecting those conversations? Or not protecting them, I guess.
You're right. I don't really think about it much, just kind of assume my messages are private. But I guess maybe that's not a good assumption.
Not always. Not all messaging apps are made equal. Some have basic encryption, maybe protecting your messages when they're being sent, but not when they're just sitting on the app servers.
So what should people be looking for?
End-to-end encryption, it's often shortened to E2E. That's the gold standard.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
It means that only you, the sender, and the person you're sending the message to can read it. No one else, not even the app company itself, can decrypt it.
Like a sealed envelope, no one can peek inside except the recipient.
Exactly. And the good news is a lot of popular messaging apps offer E2EE now.
Well, that's good. But are there any downsides?
Well, there's one main one. If you lose your device or forget your password, you're out of luck. There's no way to recover those messages, even for the app company.
So it's like extra security, but with a chance of losing everything.
You got it. But for a lot of people, the privacy is worth it. What about social media? Do those platforms use encryption?
I was just thinking about that.
It's a mixed bag with social media. Sometimes they'll encrypt messages or DMs, but anything you post publicly, that's usually not encrypted.
I guess that makes sense. They need to be able to access that stuff.
Right. And let's be honest, social media companies are in the data business. They collect and analyze tons of user data.
Always good to remember that.
Yeah,
So read those privacy policies, know what you're sharing.
absolutely. You know, beyond messaging and social media, we've got video conferencing too. That's become a big one.
Yeah, for sure, especially with so many people working remotely now.
And a lot of platforms offer E2EE for video calls, so only the people on the call can see or hear what's going on. Super important for sensitive conversations, like in business or healthcare.
It's kind of wild how encryption's woven into so much of what we do online.
It really is. And it's not just about personal stuff, it's crucial for financial transactions too. Online banking, e-commerce, all that relies heavily on encryption.
I think about that every time I buy something online. So how does it work exactly? How does encryption protect my credit card info?
Well, when you're doing any kind of online banking or shopping, your browser sets up a secure connection with the website that's HTTPS.
Right, that secure tunnel we talked about earlier.
Yep. And within that connection, encryption's working to protect all your sensitive information. Credit card numbers, bank details, all that stuff. It keeps anyone from snooping and stealing your data.
Okay, but what about the companies themselves? I mean, they have access to that information, right?
True, good companies have strict security in place, and they're only supposed to use your data for legitimate purposes, like processing your order or helping with customer service. But yeah, it's always smart to check their privacy policies, see how they handle your information.
Makes sense. So encryption's got our backs for both data in transit and data at rest when it comes to financial stuff. What about this new world of cryptocurrency? Does encryption play a role there?
Big time. Cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin, they rely heavily on cryptography for security and transparency.
I've heard the term blockchain thrown around a lot, but I don't really get it. How does encryption tie into that?
So the blockchain is essentially this decentralized record of every transaction. And encryption's what makes it work. It secures the transactions, makes sure the participants are who they say they are, and ensures the integrity of the whole system. It's complicated, but without encryption, cryptocurrency wouldn't exist.
Wow, so even though crypto is pretty new, encryption's like the foundation.
You got it. And we can't forget about critical infrastructure. Things like power grids, transportation systems, all that. Encryption plays a huge role there, too.
I never really thought about that, but it's true. Everything's so interconnected now, it's all vulnerable.
And encryption helps protect those systems, prevents unauthorized access, and keeps things running smoothly. Think about it. Encryption can secure communication between different parts of the power grid, making it much harder to disrupt.
So encryption is not just about individual safety. It's about national security and keeping essential services up and running.
Exactly. And it's also about protecting our privacy and freedoms in an increasingly digital world.
Right, finding that balance between security and privacy.
Exactly. Encryption lets us communicate, share information without worrying about being spied on or censored. And the more data we generate online, the more important encryption becomes.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. What's the bottom line? What's the key takeaway for our listeners when it comes to encryption?
It's a powerful tool, plain and simple. It protects our data, our privacy, our digital lives. We should all be using it and understanding it.
It's not just tech jargon. It has a real impact on our lives and on society as a whole.
You said it. It's a topic worth learning about and thinking about.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into encryption. It's a fascinating world, always evolving, so stay curious and keep those digital shields strong.